Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 31, Blaine's POV. I stood up, swiftly catching my daughter as Kennedy lost her grip. Her muscles going limp, she lost consciousness. Katniss immediately rushed over, reaching out to grab my daughter from my hands as I carefully placed her into her arms. My chest felt heavy as I stared down at my mate in panic, my heart beating rapidly as I grabbed the standing heart monitor that was monitoring Kenny's heart rate. Her heartbeat was rapidly losing strength as her chest began to rise and fall slowly, the sound echoing through the room, her heart's rhythm slowing and with each agonizing second that went by. My head swung to the side as I glared at the pack doctor. Do something. Bring her back. I growled, frustrated, as I began walking towards him. He backed away, trying to move from my line of sight as he quickly moved round the hospital bed. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You need to calm down, he ordered weakly, his hands making vulnerable hand gestures as he tried to defuse the situation. You're going to bring her back. My voice deepened husky, taking on a frightening tone as I glared at the pack doctor. He nodded before slowly moving around me, not wanting to startle a wolf. Once he got past me, he grabbed more wires as he began attaching them to my mate's chest. I took a few deep breaths, watching his every move fiercely. I knew this wasn't his fault, but I was just struggling to keep myself together. She's a live alpha. Her body was just unable to handle the pain, and so her brain has forced her system to shut down while it tries to repair itself. I nodded at George's words. Lena appeared at my side, her hand grabbing the hem of my shirt, diverting my attention to her. I had forced myself up with such force when Kenny had lost consciousness that the needle in my hand was sticking out painfully as blood poured out of the open wound. Being distracted, I hadn't even noticed until Lena grabbed my hand, looking up at me sadly as she delicately removed the needle. Grabbing an antiseptic wipe, then rubbing it gently over my open wound. Just like you promised, Kenny, I promise you that she will be fine, Lena whispered as she looked up at me. I said nothing, only sending her a small smile as she pulled me into her embrace. I held onto her tightly, her arms wrapping round me as she squeezed me slightly, my arms looping around her shoulders as her head laid on my chest as I looked down at my mate in the hospital bed. Lena pulled back, looking at me and my daughter, who now laid down quietly in an incubator due to being born premature. Even with her werewolf genes, she was born too early. Since we don't get our wolves until we're 16, we're technically only human, meaning that we can still get ill. And although we heal quicker than a normal human, our werewolf healing doesn't kick in until we have shifted. She's so beautiful, Blaine, Lena complimented as she ushered me over. My daughter was tiny, yet her little features were so beautiful. She looked identical to Kenny, all but her eyes. She had my mother's deep blue eyes, tiny flecks of white dazzling in between. The moment the thought entered my mind, Lena spoke as if she somehow knew what I had been thinking. She does have Blair's eyes. She nodded, smiling brightly at me. She does, I replied, nodding. I took one last long look at my daughter before heading to the door to leave. Blaine, Lena's panicked voice entered my hearing as I took a step out the door. Where are you going? Her voice seeping with concern. I stopped and turned my head to the side, not fully looking at her as I pursed my lips, my tongue sliding across my teeth as I growled. To kill that bitch. I caught Lena shiver slightly at my cold tone before I walked away. I stalked towards the AC's house. He was Melissa's true mate, and I had met a few months ago when I had thrown Melissa into a cell for attempting to trick Kennedy into thinking I wanted to be with her. If anyone knew where Melissa would be, it was him. I gave control to my wolf as I pulled my arm back, punching my fist through the wooden door. As it began to crack, the splitty wood fell onto the floor as I smashed my way through his house, wanting to frighten him. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening intently to the sound of footsteps as someone came running down the stairs. It was the AC. At first he had been in a protective stance until he heard my dangerous growl, and soon apprehension replaced the previous emotion in his eyes. I stalked forward, yanking him harshly by his t-shirt, dragging him carelessly behind me as I walked to my destination. I ignored all his attempts to shuffle out of my hold, and his begging to loosen my grip. His cries were overlooked as I shoved him roughly backwards into a prison cell, his body slamming forcefully against the cold hard floor as he stared at me petrified. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He begged, pushing himself into the corner of the cell. I stood towering over him, my wolf at the edge of my control. Where is she? I spat menacingly, my intent clear as I slowly bent down to be face to face with him, my nose practically touching his. He was trembling, his body shaking, as he slowly opened his mouth attempting to speak, but the words were stuck, unable to come out. I clenched my teeth, getting irritated as he continued fumbling his words as he sat opposite me terrified. I grabbed him, yanking him up, forcing him to look into my eyes. Don't make me ask again, I threatened, my voice coming out painfully slow as my patience wore thin. Eyes EAC stumbled out, until we both felt the presence of my beta standing next to me, which made him go quiet. Adrian skidded a chair into the middle of the room. I shoved the AC into it harshly, his body collapsing into the chair, tumbling backwards. Adrian laughed amused, whereas I stood deadly still watching as helped him up, pushing AC against another chair. Start talking, Adrian commanded, his demeanor turning defensive as he stood protectively next to me. Zizi took a few deep breaths, his body cowering into the chair. She left me. She said she was leaving, his tone breathless. She said she met a rogue and he was going to help her carry out a plan, but she never told me what. You're telling me, Adrian began, his tone sarcastic, that your mate left you and wouldn't tell you what her plan was. He snarled, narrowing his eyes at the AC accusingly. No, she rejected me. He looked away, heartbroken and embarrassed. All I know is she left to meet a rogue named Alexander. I frowned at this, his statement catching my attention. Alexander. I repeated, my muscles stiffening as I waited impatiently for his reply. My penetrating gaze forcing EC to look down. ZAC only nodded, confirming my thoughts. Adrian and I stared at each other for a moment, both in thought. We both knew who Alexander was. He was a vicious rogue, and thought of him angered my wolf. What direction did she go? Adrian questioned, changing the subject back to Melissa. She went east towards the unclaimed territory, he provided, his voice low. I breathed in deeply, taking a step back, looking at my beta who stared back at me, his eyebrows raising as he waited for my command. I cracked my jaw in thought, the slight pain distracting me for a moment. I'm going to head towards the East Territory. I'll take a few wolves with me, I said through our mind link, and he nodded in reply. I purposely said my command out loud, wanting the AC to be alarmed. You can deal with him. They both understood the meaning behind my words as AC stood up slightly in the chair, his stance tense. Despair and terror evident in his eyes as realization hit him. No, please. He begged, startled, his eyes boring into mine as he moved from the chair, his knees now on the floor. I stepped back at the edge of the cell, sending him a sinister smirk, my lips curling up into a smile. His death would make Melissa crumble. The pain of losing her mate would be excruciating despite her rejection. The thought made me smile. Kill him. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Taking one last glance at Melissa's mate, His screams could be heard as he pleaded for his life. The loud, satisfying sound of his neck snapping into came shortly after. Chapter 30 to Blaine's POV. By the time I had finished explaining as much as I knew to Gabriel, he was wanting to rush over here with Lara, both concerned about their daughter. Not knowing fully what had happened made it difficult. We would all have to wait until Kenny woke up to know the whole truth. Like me, Gabriel was furious and his wolf wanted blood. It was late, and in the early hours of the morning when I phoned him, I had barely slept as I went back and forth with visiting the pack infirmary. I managed to get a small amount of sleep the next evening. It was 9 o'clock according to my laptop, as I stayed busy in my office. I have phoned numerous packs surrounding my territory informing them of the situation. I had delegated my pack walls with searching the territories on all sides in case the AC was lying, trying to protect his mate. Bina kept coming into my office trying to force-feed me food, which I continuously turned away, my appetite clearly not apparent. It was something she did often. "Blaine, please eat something." She whined, as she pushed the plate closer to me. I sent her a small smile as I pushed the plate back towards her. "I'm not hungry." She rolled her eyes at me in frustration. "You need to eat something. You haven't eaten in hours." When I didn't reply, she sighed, for the moment letting it go. "Are you going to visit Kenny and the baby later?" I nodded my head in confirmation, but before I could say anything, I was interrupted by the phone ringing. Ina sent me a quick smile. "I'll let you have privacy," she said before pushing the plate towards me, pouting slightly, making me roll my eyes at her persistence. "Hello," I answered once I pulled the phone up to my ear. "Blaine. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I've been trying to get a hold of you for the past 2 days. Is everything all right?" His voice concerned. I could tell there was a deep frown sporting his facial expression. I wanted to avoid having this conversation with him. Maverick was my daughter's mate, and although I had accepted it, he would be a distraction and I needed to focus. I leaned back on my chair, explaining what had happened to Pierce. He stayed silent while I spoke. He was shocked and confused by the situation. I heard some rustling on the other side of the phone just before Pierce spoke. "Sorry, Ava just walked in," he informed. "Do you need us to do anything?" To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I've got wolves searching for her. She won't be able to hide any longer. Right now, there is nothing I can do until I hear back from my trackers. When you do, let me know. You've got our backing, Pierce stated, and I was grateful. A voice suddenly spoke. "I hope Kenny is better soon. I cannot wait to see the baby." Pierce interrupting me before I could speak. "I know that you were due to have Maverick, but we can keep him here till things get better." I pursed my lips for a second and thought, deciding against my better judgment. "No, bring him here, it might be a good thing. It might help my daughter heal quicker with Maverick there pestering her," I said reluctantly, my eyes rolling as Pierce chuckled. "We'll arrive tomorrow then?" He questioned and I agreed. We said our goodbyes shortly after that. I put the phone down before taking a couple of bites out of my food to please Lena. After chuckling my plate in the sink, I made my out the house in the direction of the pack house. Last night, George had informed me that although Kenny is still unconscious and in a coma, her vital signs were looking good, and while she was out he managed to reset her bones back into place. He had also nervously informed me that Kenny had a lot of damage to her ovaries and her werewolf genes were unable to heal them, due to her body shutting down on its own. Her wolf severing ties to her human body once her body shut down. He had found a needle mark in her arm indicating someone had injected her with silver, her blood tests coming out positive. George attempted to try to save at least one during surgery but was unsuccessful and he ended up having to remove them both. I was devastated but held my wolf down. I knew Kenny would hurt 10 times more. I was just thankful that we managed to have a daughter. I stood next to the incubator as my daughter slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling before she gently opened her eyes, staring straight back into mine. I stayed there for a while, enjoying the silence until the clock chimed 12. I placed my hand on the glass, unable to touch my baby girl as she was too weak, and George didn't want to run any risks as she had been exposed to silver in Kennedy's blood. I walked over to my mate, kissing her on her forehead, then headed home, knowing that Maverick would be arriving at midday. I lowly growled, slightly losing my patience as the young pup raced around my house in his wolf form. Maverick wasn't able to control his wolf yet. He was too young, and as he gets older he needed to learn to master his wolf. Pierce and Dava had arrived, along with Gabriel and Laura, who were already visiting Kenny and the baby. I decided to stay back with Maverick, allowing them time with her before taking Maverick with me later. Gabriel, Pierce and I had a short discussion about what had happened. I told them that I had Melissa's mate killed and that I went searching the East Territory. Rogues had staked their claim on the territory, which amused me, as it would be the land I would be taking over eventually. I scoured the area along with a few pet warriors, but we found nothing. A few rogues caught my attention, and the ones I caught up with and interrogated quickly met their death after they refused to provide me with information. Adrian walked into the living room, where Maverick and I were watching television. We had trackers searching every side of my territory in search of Melissa and Alexander. I needed to stay close, not wanting to sway too far from Kennedy or my daughter in case their conditions deteriorated. Blaine, Adrian called my name. I found out some information. One of our trackers is an eye view of what Alexander and Melissa are hiding. My eyebrow raised, waiting for him to continue. They're not in the East Territory. They're hiding in between unclaimed territory between us and the Stone Warriors pack. I frowned at the new revelation. Melissa knew about Kennedy's pregnancy, but not that our door had found her mate. She must not have realized that Pierce and I no longer had any conflict. I smirked at the thought. That might just be beneficial. Adrian's face mirrored mine. Make sure they stay back, monitoring everything they do, but do not let them break their cover. I commanded. We had the benefit of surprise then. I would need to discuss the finding with Gabriel and Pierce when we next got the chance. They were staying on my territory tonight, so I decided to call them for a meeting early tomorrow morning. It was around 7 in the evening when I finally brought Maverick to the pack infirmary. He was very restless and became extremely excited by the time we got there. The moment his hand touched the glass, my daughter's eyes opened wide, staring into Maverick's as he lowly growled. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilbane, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I rolled my eyes as my daughter made noises. I moved away, leaving Maverick sitting on a chair next to the incubator as he began mumbling to her. I stood next to Kenny. She was still out, but her face was beginning to look a lot less pale. A pink magenta in her cheeks, her heartbeat sounding better than it did the day before, making me hopeful. 2 hours later, I was standing in my kitchen with Maverick sitting on a kitchen stool as he shoved the last bite of food into his mouth. He started staring at me, instantly making me stare straight back. My eyebrow raising as he looked up at me, a question dancing in his eyes. You know, for me to know what you want, you've got to at least ask the question, which, by the way, requires you to speak. I said, smirking. He still looked hesitant, still deciding whether he should ask or not. I waited patiently while I continued to stare at him. Can I stay with you? He mumbled. I was taken back for a moment. I nodded, reaching out for him, and he obliged as I carried him upstairs. Now that Lena had bathed and fed him, it was practically his bedtime. I placed him on the bed on Kennedy's side, throwing on a movie. Maverick was soon fast asleep, his body laying in a weird position. My own eyes began to feel heavy, shutting as I fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 33. Blaine's POV. Gabriel turned to look at me smartly. They won't be expecting this. He concludes as we all sat down in my office going through the plan. Gabriel and Pierce both agreed that it would be best to attack them in the unclaimed territory. It would provide more protection for our wolves since Melissa and Alexander were hiding between mine and Pierce's border. Pierce frowned when I had shared the information. My trackers still observing out of sight while keeping tracks on both wolves, providing me with information every few hours. They had informed me that there were around 40 rogues who were in and out of an older band and were house located deep within the woods. They had overheard them speaking about Alexander attempting to take my alpha title. I chuckled darkly, amused at Alexander's deluded ideas. After hours of discussion, we had all agreed that we needed to attack first, as thankfully we had the element of surprise. Benjamin was due to arrive soon. We wanted to attack within the next 2 days since my tracker had overheard them confirming their plans to attack in 5 days. Benjamin was going to stay behind with my pack to protect my territory, my mate and my daughter, while Gabriel, Pierce and I left with pack warriors. Since they were holding back their attack, we assumed that they were not ready, and we didn't want to give them any more time to plan or prepare, but we knew ourselves that we would need at least to get our wolves ready. The fact the unclaimed territory was between both mine and Pierce's territory was a bonus. It gave us the advantage in attacking them from both sides, their defense weakened and poor. Just as I was about to ask Adrian to prepare our pack warriors, Gabriel began questioning me on my relationship with Alexander and why he was involving himself. What exactly is the history between you and this Alexander? I looked up from the paperwork on my desk to face him. I clenched my jaw a little before looking at Adrian, then back at Gabriel. When I was 17, his best friend Kane tried to take my alpha title. I fought him and won, and he died as the consequence. Alexander was left feeling furious and revengeful. I paused for a moment before continuing. And then, one day when my third in command was running the border, he was attacked and they killed him brutally. Ever since then, we've hated each other. Adrian and I had found my third in command, Jackson, at the edge of our border, his body ripped into pieces days after I had fought and won against Kane. Alexander's scent lingered in the area. He had killed Jackson because he was bitter and hateful for what I had done to his friend. I had sworn revenge, but Alexander disappeared and I never got his scent. I had only just begun to believe he had been killed by another pack or rogue as years went by with no clue of his whereabouts, when EAC suddenly mentioned his name. I had promised Jackson's mate Helly that I would not replace him, and I never swayed from that promise, which was why I took on Jackson's role as third. Pierce nodded in understanding. Then why didn't you kill him? He questioned, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. I breathed in deeply. It was conversation I didn't like talking about. I wanted to, and I tried, but he disappeared and I assumed he had been killed. But this time, I'll get the job done. I growled, determined. A threat lingering. Kennedy's POV. A light shone brightly above my face, my eyes sensitive to the intruding glare. I gently pried them open, my eyes squinting as I moved my head to the side, wanting to avoid the bright source. My senses were on high alert. The sudden rich and unpleasant smell of antiseptics made my nose twitch and my mouth curl in disgust. I groaned slightly as I attempted to turn into a more comfortable position on my side. A sudden pull on my chest made me pause, only then noticing the sticky tabs and the red and blue wires attached to my chest, a monitor stationed next to my bed. The sound of my heart beating flowed through the room, as the machine continued to make beeping noises. I groaned slightly before flashes of my memories invaded my mind. The memories of Melissa and the birth of my daughter had me shuffling up, the crisp sheets on the hospital bed moving uncomfortably beneath me. I noticed an incubator lay situated in the corner of the room, The sound of my daughter's breathing flooded me with relief. Reaching up to remove the sticky tabs from my chest, I was greeted by George, who walked in unexpectedly, his eyes going wide as he sees me awake. Even enthusiasm, he even did a double take as if his imagination was messing with him. "You're awake?" Once realizing that his eyes were not deceiving him, he quickly rushed over to me, ordering me to lay back down while stopping me from removing any more wires. "Don't move yet. I need to check everything first." I nodded at him, and he began to replace the sticky tabs and wires that I had removed. "Blaine is on his way," George informed me, as he checked all the monitors once again, writing down a few notes. "You healed quickly, although your wolf diminished due to silver being found in your blood." "You found silver in my blood?" I was shocked and confused by his comment. "Yes, I found a marking on your arm, and after you gave birth I was able to conduct blood tests and the results came back positive for silver. You can feel your wolf now though. To where Aiken kicks coordinator, Madeline Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I nodded. The silver would have worn out by now. I could feel my wolf in my mind. She was pacing and wanted out. And she wanted Melissa's blood. George's eyebrows suddenly furrowed into a frown, his eyes not meeting mine as he spoke. "I tried my hardest with recessing your bones, but I'm very sorry, Luna, but I was unable to." At this point, Blaine rushed in, momentarily stopping our conversation. I ignored the worry I felt, knowing I could question him later. Right now, I wanted to be with my mate and daughter. Within seconds, Blaine stood next to me, kissing me deeply, and I smiled as he pulled away. He scanned my full body, then his eyes caught mine as he brushed my hair out my face, his fingers running through my hair. "You all right?" A concerned look in his eyes. My voice was sore and came out hoarse as my throat felt like sandpaper. "I'm fine," I whispered. "What about you and daughter?" He nodded, a sudden large grin plastering his face. "She's beautiful." My facial expression echoed his as George carefully pulled the incubator over, pulling it beside me. "She's very healthy and she's recovering quickly. That young mate of hers seems to be helping." Before leaving Blaine, I alone, I smiled as I looked down, yet nervous to pick her up. "Do you want me to pick her up?" Blaine asked, as if he sensed my worry. I nodded and shuffled up slightly to get into a better sitting position. I felt a wave of anxiety as he picked her up before gently placing her into my arms. "She is beautiful," I confirmed, the same smile never leaving as I looked at her lovingly. He hummed in reply. "I was only able to hold her late last night. Maverick seems to help speed up the process. Until you get your wolf at the age of 16, we were only human, meaning we could catch a common cold, but our systems did recover a lot quicker. She will still need to stay here for a couple more days, but George said that you can come home today." Maverick suddenly appeared before I could reply, his head poking around the infirmary door, his eyes guiltily catching Blaine's gaze. "I told you I would get you in a minute," Blaine said, rolling his eyes. I laughed, gesturing for Maverick to come over. Blaine helped Maverick up onto the bed, placing him gently next to me. Maverick reached over, giving me a hug before he turned back to my daughter. We all stayed there for a while until we all began to feel tired. I was anxious to leave her there alone overnight, but George confirmed that there was always a nurse with her, checking her progress every hour. I laid comfortably in bed. Maverick and I had both fell asleep. Lena came up a short while later to grab him for his dinner. Blaine suddenly appeared, sitting next to me on the bed, his hands reaching out, grabbing me up my hips, putting me on top of him, a smirk on his lips. "I missed you. I missed you," I repeated, leaning forward to kiss his lips. He growled lustfully, which made me giggle, but I was too tired and exhausted, so we spoke for a while, waiting for our dinner to be cooked since Lena decided she wanted to cook us all a meal. You know, we still haven't decided her name, Blaine said. I pursed my lips, still indecisive. All the names you liked were awful. He gave me an impassive look, not amused at my comment. They were not that bad, his tone slightly defensive, causing me to laugh. We don't need to decide straight away. We can wait a few days and test out names. Both in agreement, we went downstairs. Lena had thankfully helped me out, bathing and getting Maverick ready for bed since I needed to try and rest as much as possible. Blaine had ordered Wolf to start work on Maverick's room, which was located next to our daughter's. I laughed when I noticed he had followed through with his promise. A lock screwed into the doorframe. I rolled my eyes at him, which he returned with a teasing smirk. Entering the kitchen, I was immediately engulfed into a hug as Lena squeezed me tightly, ordering me to sit down at the kitchen table. Not long later, Liam arrived and we all sat there patiently as Lena began dishing up the dinner. We all sat there eating, discussing what had happened over the past few days. The sound of a door slamming open had Blaine in a protective position, his chair flying backwards as he stood up from his seated position. He glared at the door, his eyes in slits as he waited for the person to enter. Adrian rushed in, a look of sheer panic on his face, his hair all disheveled as his eyes landed on Blaine's. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Adrian began but stopped as he breathed in deeply, trying to catch his breath. Blaine relaxed a little, his eyes still on Adrian as he looked at his beta with confusion. What's going on? He demanded, being impatient as Adrian ran a hand through his hair, looking conflicted, and his emotions all over the place. We caught rogues near our borders, he began, his gaze suddenly moving from Blaine's to mine. We caught them, but... Blaine interrupted, growling darkly at Adrian's information as he continued to stall. Blaine, Adrian sighed deeply, looking at Blaine warily. One of the rogues is my mate. Chapter 34. All that could be heard was Lena's gasp as she looked at her son, and then to Blaine. Her eyes were full of worry as she stared at my mate, everyone deadly silent for a few moments as tension began to fill the air. Adrian had an impassive expression and he was now hiding his emotions, yet his eyes showed exactly how anxious he felt. His chest rising and falling in quick succession as we all waited for Blaine to speak. He didn't, and it was Lena who brought him out of his trance. Blaine, Lena said, as she moved around the table to stand next to him, her hand linking around his arm. Blaine's closed look turned into a questionable one. He knew exactly what everyone was thinking as his concentration turned from Lena to Adrian. I'm not going to kill your mate, Adrian, he confirmed, his voice low. Blaine was known to be merciless when it came to rogues, and we had all experienced or heard the stories about how he would brutally kill them with no compassion or kindness. Lena looked relieved as her grip on Blaine's arm continued before she let go, rushing over to Adrian. I myself felt relieved, satisfied that my mate was telling the truth. The family he did have, he would never intentionally hurt. I walked over and pecked his lips. He didn't smile, but nodded at me, pulling my body to his. He then turned to face Adrian, his voice tight and his alpha tone seeping in. But, he began, we need to interrogate her. She may be your mate, but she is still a rogue and I need to make sure that my pack's safety is not in jeopardy. Liam nodded, agreeing with Blaine. You can put her in the office prison cells. I rolled my eyes at Blaine's suggestion, remembering how he kept me there on many occasions. The office cells were much nicer than the one located as you walk into the underground prison. I'll meet you down there, Adrian confirmed, rushing off in a hurry to get back to his mate. I should come with you. Looking at Blaine. I knew how intimidating and irrational he could be, especially when it came to rogues, regardless of whether they had good or bad intentions. Surprisingly, he nodded and grabbed my hand before we began walking towards the packed prison. The moment he opened the door, my body wrenched at the stench of old dry blood. The metallic smell mixed with rotting flesh made my stomach clench as I held down the urge to throw up. Blaine held my hand tightly, forcing me to stay closely behind him as we followed the walkway to his office. Walking in, I straight away noticed a young female, probably in her early 20s. She had long blonde hair reaching down to her hips, her eyes never swaying from Adrian's as they both sat in the office. Our arrival immediately forced them to look away, as they both stared at Blaine and me. She looked at Blaine, then looked towards me with a small smile. I smiled back, intrigued by Adrian's newfound mate. I'm Kennedy and this is my mate, Blaine. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Introducing myself as we walked further into the room, she nodded, slightly moving away. Blaine's aura was intense even for a rogue who didn't have to obey an alpha. Adrian moved to sit next to her, and she leaned in slightly, wanting comfort. I'm Alexis. Go in there, Blaine ordered, forcing us to all sit in the cell that was located next to his desk. I rolled my eyes but followed them in there. We sat opposite them. It was quiet for a few moments until Blaine leaned in, his upper body moving to be closer to Alexis, his eyes narrowing on hers as he began to question her motives, wanting to get straight to the point. Why are you here? His tone was harsh, his jaw clenched shut so tight that you could see the muscles in his face flex. She looked up at Adrian, then back at Blaine. I think you know why. Blaine raised an eyebrow, amused at her short answer as a slight smirk lingered on his lips at the way she replied. His expression turned stone hard, looking at Alexis with a penetrating gaze. Do you know what their plan is or when they are due to attack? I cringed at his tone. Alexander never gave us that kind of information. All he told us was that he planned to do it within the next few days. He didn't want to be specific in case one of us thought it would be a good idea to share the information with you for money. Her words sounded truthful as her gaze never left Blaine's. Melissa had told Alexander about your plans on taking the unclaimed territory in the east. I frowned at this. We kept all this information away from the pack as we didn't want to expose Maverick's relationship to our daughter. He wants to create his own pack, and with your plans to overtake that land. Alexander and Melissa decided to take action before you could. Blaine growled at Alexis's disclosure. He wants to create his own pack. Adrian questioned, his disgust evident. Him and Melissa are now marked and mated. Apparently, according to her nodding at Blaine. A hurt true mate, and that's why Alexander is helping her. He wants revenge for how much you hurt her. It was my turn to growl, jealousy flowing through my veins, outraged at her words. He's my mate. She's delusional and bitter that Blaine did not want her, and the fact I was pregnant just tipped her over the edge. Alexis was shocked, taken back by my statement. That's not what they're both claiming to be true, but I believe you. Blaine continued his harsh glare, watching Alexis's every move, still cautious. His real reason is because I killed his best friend years ago, not because he gives a fuck about Melissa. His words cold and harsh. Alexis was taken back but continued speaking. Alexander also plans to take your alpha title for himself. Blaine growled darkly at this. He had assumed that was Alexander's plan, but hearing it out loud confirmed it. Alexis shuffled a little in the chair, moving her body slightly as she squirmed under Blaine's intense gaze that was directed straight at her. Your next answer to this question dictates what will happen next. Blaine began, his body hunched up as he looked more intimating, his stance now menacingly as he leaned even closer to Alexis. Do you still want to help Alexander know? she promised, her eyes never swaying as her words came out quickly with no hesitation. I found my mate and it's all I want, she added, looking up at Adrian, who held her tightly to his body. Blaine looked at Adrian and then at me. Continuing to stare before he pulled back, now leaning against the wall as he nodded, satisfied with her answer. The intensity of her stare back at Blaine proved her reply as truthful. Adrian physically relaxed from the protective and stiff posture he had while Blaine interrogated his mate. "Do you know how many rogues he has backing him?" I questioned, bringing the conversation back as we fell into silence. "He's about 40, maybe 45, she replied. Blaine nodded as if he knew this information already. Most of the rogues that are in the belief that he will be paying them for their help. As ridiculous as it sounds, and to be honest with you, the reason I was going to help was because he helped save my sister a few years ago. But there are rogues that would go against him," Alexis added. Blaine was doubtful, and it was clear from his body language. "You also have my brother. Although I am a rogue I never wanted to be, and there are others who feel the same. I could tell you who would be truthful and who would not be." Adrian nodded and looked at Blaine for confirmation. "What's the next move?" I questioned as Blaine said nothing, deep in thought. Blaine began before he was once again interrupted by a teenage boy, slamming open the office door, forcing Adrian and Blaine to stand protectively in front of Alexis and I. They stood there, defensively blocking the view of the office door. Blaine narrowed his eyes at the boy as he began breathing heavily, struggling to catch his breath. "Calm down," Blaine growled as he took steps towards him, his wolf making his presence known. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." His words began to stumble out and panicked. We were under attack. Chapter 35. Blaine's POV. My eyebrows furrowed into a deep frown as my mind contemplated and analyzed the words that came out of the wolf's mouth. A dark growl rumbled deep within my chest as it began to get tight from anger. I turned towards Adrian, then to Alexis, and finally my mate, who all stared at me with wide eyes. "Stay here with them," I ordered Adrian, who quickly moved back into the cell, allowing me to slam the cell door shut, forcing them all to stay put and unable to leave on their own accord. Quite frankly, I don't trust Adrian's mate with mine. It all seemed very convenient and predictable that Alexander has chosen this moment to attack, and I wasn't about to leave Kennedy alone with a rogue regardless of her mate bond with my beta. "Blaine," Kennedy shouted as I slammed the lock down, staring through the small window trying to capture my attention, but I moved back, giving her a quick glance as I rushed out the room. I grabbed the boy's arm, dragging him behind me as we jogged towards the exit as I gave him orders. I yanked the door open and slammed it shut, making sure the prison was on full lockdown as I typed in a code only Adrian I knew. "Go straight to the pack house. You know where the safe room is, and help everyone get in there, and don't come out until I say so." The teenager nodded and quickly turned, racing towards the pack house. After analyzing the whole clearing, I shifted into my wolf with him taking complete control, compelling all my instincts to dominate as I raced clearing, my wolf directing us towards the border. The temperature outside was crisp, swirls of white leaving my mouth as my paws thundered through the woodland, my paws digging deep into the ground as bolted through the forest. The stench of rogues had led me in the direction of my house, baffling me as to how they managed to get that far into my territory, which only enraged me more. Enthusiasm in the near distance. I saw my house coming into view, and as I got closer, the clearing was littered with rogues and my pack wolves as they fought. The distinct and recognizable smell of death and rotting flesh lingered in the air. My eyes landed on a large brown wolf, and I growled murderously at him, running straight towards him, tackling him onto the ground as my claws extended and ripped across his throat, his blood squirting into my face. Before I could move, Another wolf jumped on me, attempting to force me onto my back, but I quickly hunched my shoulders, forcing him onto his. I snarled at him as I managed to get the upper position, caging his wolf behind mine. I reached down, gripping his neck between my teeth as I buried them deep as I ripped his throat out, his body going limp beneath me. I quickly moved off, continuing to fight Threads as I noticed both Gabriel and Pearson their wolf forms. I dodged a rope, killing him quickly as I impatiently waited and set for the scent that I was dying to catch. Then finally, I caught it. In the corner of my eye, I spotted Melissa standing in the distance towards a building, her head ever so often poking out to see what was going on, and thankfully she hadn't noticed me. She looked anxious and understandable since their numbers were drastically lowering. I ignored the fighting around me as I stalked towards her, my focus solely on hers until Alexander suddenly appeared, stopping me in my tracks. He stood there, grabbing Melissa's hand as he glared towards me, and suddenly everyone froze, all waiting to hear what he had to say. You know, Blaine, for someone who's had his title since he was a child, I'm surprised you've managed to keep it for so long, and I think it's time you finally have it ripped out your hands. Not appreciating his threat, I growled my wolf, begging for him to try. He smirked at me. I'll just have to rip your throat out for what you did to my best friend and for what you've done to my mate. He looked down at Melissa, his mark bearing in the crook of her neck on full display. I shifted and 4 of my pack wolves moved to surround me, protecting me from any surprise attack since I was now in my human form and I was thrown a pair of shorts. You know, Alexander, purposely being condescending. For someone who's such a coward, I'm surprised you've managed to survive for so long. I laughed when his face went hard, his eyes narrowing on me as he glared at me, hatred in his eyes. Instead of trying to save Kane, you ran, didn't you? You left your best friend to die in my territory. I didn't run. He snarled at me as his eyes flashed dangerously between his and his wolves. And you killed him before I could help him. You've taken everything away from me and from Melissa. I shake my head, remembering what Alexis had said earlier. Melissa is not my true mate. She's just a power-hungry whore who wants to fuck her way to leadership. Melissa's cheeks turned a rosy red, knowing my words were truthful, but she bowed her head down slightly so that Alexander was unable to see her reaction, and in return he growled, his own face turning red from fury. You see, Alexander addressed, his eyes looking between my pack and the rogues. This alpha has no respect towards his Luna, his true Luna. Is that who you want in power? I rolled my eyes at his pathetic attempt to persuade my wolves into deceiving them to follow him. Are you done? I said, laughing, my face turning into a grin as I stared at him. This is rather boring, and as you stated earlier, I'm excited to see you try to rip my throat out, as that's the only way you're ever going to have my title. From my words he saw Ed and shifted into his grey wolf. A growl escaped his lips as mouth twisted into a smile as he leapt towards me. I shifted in time, but he managed to lunge at me, forcing me to land sternly on my side. I forced myself up as we began to circle each other. The muscles at our backs hutching up as we get into a protective stance. Wolves around us fought as Alexander and I went one-on-one, but I knew Alexander could play dirty and I kept my back up and always alert. I made the first move, tackling him, compelling him to the muddy ground with a huge thud. He swiftly moved before I could go for his neck, dodging me and moving to the side as he both began to claw each other, drawing blood from our wounds as it seeped into the ground. My muscle felt tense as we continued to circle and damped each other up, both snarling in each other's direction. I caught his face, causing a weak growl to leave his lips, as my claw dug into his right eye. He snarled at me warningly, and then pounced on me, sinking his teeth into my side. He attempted to claw at my neck, his intent clear as he missed my throat. Growling menacingly at him as I launched my body onto his, causing both of us to tumble, and within seconds, I took hold of his neck, my jaw snapping down hard on his neck as it snapped in two. I growled, satisfied, dropping his limp body from my mouth as it hit the floor with a thud. His blood splattered across my fur as I trained my eyes on Melissa, who now stood frozen in fear as she huddled by the wall. I gnawed off him, noticing that my pack wolves had begun to link silver chains around the hands of a few rogues as they now sit in a row. Gabriel and Pierce had shifted, and Gabriel now stood beside Melissa, dragging her by her arms as she shrieked, begging him to let her go as they headed towards me. He dropped her roughly in front of me, his wolf furious at what she had done to his pup. He held on to her shoulders, enabling her to escape. My eyes drifting back to the rogues who were tied up, silver chains dangling down from their wrists, the silver forcing them to stay in their human form, their wolves cowering into the back of their minds, unable to shift. The stench of their burning and rotting flesh had my wolf smirking, enjoying the bloodshed, amused at the attempt to take our alpha title. I forced my wolf to shift back, but allowing him to stay in control as I approached one of my pack wolves who stood beside the rogues, his hands protected by gloves as he held onto the chain's silver. Pierce threw a pair of shots at me as I approached, and I quickly shoved them on. Spare silver chains laid sprawled across the grass. Leaning down, I grabbed one, my mind and body accepting the pain and the burning sensations as I gripped the chain tightly. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You should wear glove, one of my wolves began, but I cut him off with a shake of my head as I headed towards Melissa, avoiding the dead bodies that now blanket across the clearing. With one hand I hold the chain and the other I drag across my face, removing Alexander's blood. At this movement, Melissa begins to scream and sob, begging me, Blaine, no. Reveling from her fear and despair. Tears rushing down her cheeks as she stared up at me, attempting to get out of Gabriel's intense grip. I tucked D at her, playfully teasing, wanting to cause her terror. Oh, Melissa. I repeated, a deep smirk caking across my face, then suddenly I yanked her up by her neck, her face opposite mine as her legs dangled in the air before I snarled in her face, putting pressure on her neck. Gabriel took a few steps back, his grip gone once I had approached. My wolf lurking in my eyes, intent on revenge for what she had done to my maiden daughter. I dropped her roughly, her breaths coming out short and heavy as she attempted to catch her breath. She began to crawl away, which made me laugh coldly at how pathetic she looked. The silver chain in my left hand was stinging, and I continued to ignore the pain as I stalked behind her, throwing the chain around her neck, forcing her up rapidly as I quickly twisted the chain around her neck 3 times, yanking it tightly as I pulled in opposite directions. Her body slammed into mine, her back leaning on my chest. Like my father, I wanted to torture her as I gripped harder and harder, the smell of our burning flesh eating my nose as she attempted to scream from the agonizing pain, her hands clawing at the chains to break free. Blai, her voice coming out hoarse and tortured. Blaine. In panic, her body began fighting, trying to shuffle and yank herself out of my hold, her breathing getting heavier and heavier as she began to feel distressed at the thought of dying. I held on, ignoring her attempts to claw at my face as her body started to go lifeless, yet still conscious, so I leaned in close to her. That's for my mate and my daughter, I whispered just before I let go, watching her body roughly fall backwards. Saliva dribbling out of her mouth, her eyes bulging out of her eye sockets from the intense pressure on her neck. Her eyes still open, a petrified look still lingering within them. I stared down. Melissa was now dead, with the silver chains now loosely laying around her neck. The clearing was silent and was throughout. I turned my head to the side to see Gabriel and Pierce staring at me with closed looks, not wanting to show me what they were thinking. I glared down at my hands, the intense pain suddenly hitting me at once. They were blood red, the flesh swollen and blistering. The tissue in my fingers beginning to turn black as blood down my fingertips, I focused my attention back to my pack wolves. Clean this up, I ordered as I headed towards Gabriel and Pierce. Chapter 36 Blaine's POV. Blaine, Gabriel began, but I cut him off as I stood in front of him and Pierce. Gabriel, you don't need to say anything. You and I deal with things very differently, and in my eyes, she deserved it. I stated, knowing that he was shocked at what had happened, at how brutal and merciless I could be. He probably expected me to kill her quickly and snap her neck in two, but I didn't want to give her that pleasure. She wanted to kill my mate and my daughter, and my wolf and I didn't take that too kindly. She had taken so much from my mate, and Kennedy hasn't even realized. I haven't been able to tell her that she wouldn't be able to have another child. Pierce got my attention as he grabbed my right wrist, looking down at my second or third degree burns. You need to get that sorted, he said as he dropped his grip, looking at me with a frown. I mind-linked George to set up the pack infirmary for our wolves and for him to check my hands. I looked around, watching as my pack wolves began to lift the bodies away to dispose of them. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. A pack warrior was leading the rogues with silver chains, still wrapped around their wrists, towards the pack prison. I debated for a few moments, wondering if I should spare their lives or not, but ended up deciding that it was a matter to consider later. I walked towards the pack infirmary, since Gabriel demanded that I sort my hands out first while Pierce and he collect Adrian and Kenny from the pack prison. I had told them to keep Alexis there, still uneasy on whether to trust her. I walk into the pack house and it is eerily quiet, since all the wolves and children who could not fight were still located in the basement, where the safe house was situated. I would allow them out in a bit, not wanting to scare the women and children with the bloody clearing or the sight of the injured wolves. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. George began as he rushed towards me after he finished attaching a drip to a wolf, a nurse taking his place as he hurriedly came to examine me. Oh well, George said, concerned, dragging me towards the sink that was already prepared and filled up with ice and cold water. He grabbed my wrists, forcing my hands to sink in. I clenched my jaw at the intense and invasive feeling as I allowed George to hold my hands in. I growled slightly, the cold water soothing yet fiercely stinging. I'm going to have to wrap them both with gauze Essen cream, and I'll have to attach you to a drip of silvers in your bloodstream, which is not allowing your wolf to heal you properly. I nodded at him in agreement, now regretting not wearing gloves yet. In the moment, I wanted to feel how she felt. An action my father used to do to me as a child, a trait I have seemingly carried on. George ordered me to stay in the same position for 20 minutes, while dragging a hospital bed towards me, forcing me to sit down. Once the time went by, he made me lay down as he searched for a prominent vein in my arm before burrowing a needle in, a drip now attached. George was rushing around the infirmary. It was getting packed in here as injured wolves came to get their wound stitched while others were leaving. Hearing my name be called, I turned to the side to find Kenny rushing towards me, tears welling up in her eyes as she approached me. Turning my hands downwards, not wanting my mate to witness how gory they looked. Her lips were immediately on mine, kissing me desperately, which I returned. She grabbed my neck, pulling herself closer to me as she sat next to me, and I scooted over to make room. I'm so glad you're all right, she whispered against my lips as she pulled away, relief shining in her eyes. I gave her a smile, attempting to reassure her as her parents along with Adrian appeared. Blaine, Adrian addressed, nodding at me, his eyes scanning his alpha for injuries. I'm fine, I stated, wanting to reassure his wolf along with everyone else, since all my pack wolves in the infirmary were all paying attention to me. Their wolves wanting to protect their alpha. How's your hands? Gabriel said, and I wanted to strangle him in frustration as I didn't want Kennedy to see my injury yet. Noticing my frown, Gabriel's eyes went slightly wide, realizing that I wanted to keep them secret for a while. He grimaced at me, then shrugged his shoulders with a smile which made me narrow my eyes at him. I sighed deeply as Kenny went to reach for my hands, and I growled lightly, not wanting her to touch them. Blaine, oh my God, your hands. Gently grabbing my wrists, avoiding the swollen and sensitive skin. I'm fine. Stop worrying, I demanded as she began to cry. I was still trying to be wary of her emotions since her stay in the hospital along with the birth of our daughter. She breathed in deeply, understanding that I didn't want to talk about it, but her eyes lit up with a determination to find out later. We all stayed there, having small talk while Georgia tended to my wounds. I held down my anger as much as possible, with Gabriel and having to hold me down while Georgia tended to my wounds, then wrapped them up in gauzes. Thankfully, it was over quick, and I could leave a few hours later. I had already summoned a wolf to open the safe house, allowing my pack to roam the territory again as they please. Gabriel and Laura had left earlier along with Adrian, who left to collect his mate from the cells. I was still curious and had questions for the rogue, but for now, I wanted to be with my mate. Kenny and I were alone as we walked towards our home, since George had ordered me to rest at home. My wolf had already resurfaced, but George was still wary. Lena was the first to rush over to me, her small frame pulling me close as I carefully wrapped one arm around her neck, forcing her head into my shoulder as she clung on tightly. Not wanting to talk about today's events, I pulled back before she could speak. I'm starving. Looking at Lena. Her facial expression echoed mine. Good thing I made you something then. I smiled as she linked Kenny's arm in hers, dragging her towards the kitchen, my mate looking back at me with a smile as I followed. I just finished eating when Pierce, Ava and Maverick walked in. My daughter held tightly in a blanket to Ava's chest as she walked in my direction. Look who I've got. She smiled brightly. I don't think I can hold her for a while, I said with a deep breath, content with the fact that I wouldn't be able to hold my daughter. Instead, Ava leaned down and allowed me to kiss my daughter's head before passing her to Kenny, who sat beside me as she cooed at our door. Ava and Pierce sat down with us as we all spoke, speaking about everything and anything that didn't relate to today. I rolled my eyes at Maverick, who refused to sit down and instead decided to stand next to me, leaning his hands on my thighs as he attempted to get a look at his mate. I chuckled, amused yet painfully annoyed at how attached he is to my daughter. Come on then. I rolled my eyes and he grinned at me, knowing what I was referring to as I carefully lifted him up onto my lap, conscious of not putting any strain on my hands. We stayed there for a while, Maverick getting tired as his small body leaned into mine, his head trapped in the crook of my neck, as my right arm circled around his body. His eyes were shut as his chest rose and fell as he laid there in a comfortable position, fast asleep. I turned my head to seek Annie smiling at me, and then our daughter, and in that moment, I realized how grateful I was to finally have my own family. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolf Pack legend.